we just finished talking about saving and saving for the web. Now let's talk about other palettes we use in Photoshop. In Photoshop, we have the properties and the layers palette that we've been using up to now, and maybe stuff like history or color. But under Window, there's a lot of other palettes that we could probably be talking about and using. Although they're not necessarily used as often, depending on your workflow. But for me personally, I like to keep it really simple, which is why I don't use so many of them. But I want to talk about them anyway, in case you're curious. So I've done my due diligence and compiled most of the palettes that I want to talk about. So let's go through them one by one. Since we mentioned in our very first section about how I organize palettes, you can see how I categorized and added them together. So all in one, you can see a bunch of different palettes stacked together, and you can close them out by going under your tab and close tab group. To bring it back, you just click on one of the ones that are in the group, like color, and it brings them all back, okay? So I will pick them apart over here so we can talk about that independently. Under Window, the first one we have here is color. What color basically does is it's a more advanced version of this color picker here. So you can, instead of just picking the color for your foreground and background, you can also tweak it by shifting the hue. And when I say hue, I don't mean just color, because hue is basically color without the saturation setting. So for instance, the hue itself is this purplish tone, and the saturation levels differ by how far I go to the left or to the right, or up and down, because it changes how bright the color is as well. So say I like this purplish tone being a little bit bright, I can then change the hue itself. This is not something I use very often, because if I ever need to, I can always just go inside here and change the hue myself as well. Or you can keep this open on another screen in case you want more space, and then simply just change this hue and the color instead of accessing the dialog box manually. The next part here is adjustments. Now adjustments themselves are located down here under Vibrance, Hue, Color Balance, Black and White, and Photo Filter. If you're in a previous version of Photoshop, this Adjustments tab will also be exactly what Properties are. So for instance, if I go down to Curve, and you see this curve box that we adjusted for our exposure, this might previously be your Adjustments tab consolidated into one. So you might not have Properties, but you might have a tab called Adjustments. And the way they did that was, whenever I don't have an adjustment layer inside the Properties, which I don't here, it'll populate with these icons over here. And instead of Properties, it'll be called Adjustments. But they've sectioned it off so there's now two boxes. And this, again, just does the same thing that all these adjustment layers do, except it doesn't have a name unless you hover over them. And that's the only difference there is with this one. Now this Info tab is actually quite interesting, because like we talked about earlier in the camera raw setting, you can pick your color picker here, or you can come down to the color sample tool, and you can drop points on top of the image. So I'll drop one on his skin, I'll drop one on her clothes, and here it tells me that the color picker number 1 is showing me different values of RGB. So it shows me number 1, being the skin, has a red value of 229 in our channels and a green of 194. So it's reading more red than green. And like we talked about earlier, it just shows you what influence of color it has over another. And the same thing with number 2. you can see that there's almost no blue in the dress, but there's more red than any other color. And if you're unfamiliar with this concept, go back to the camera raw section where we talk about RGB and color samples. The way to delete these points is simply by holding the Alt or Option key as you hover over it, and then clicking on it, and it disappears. If you don't see these little points, go under View and make sure Extras is checked. If it's not checked, it disappears. But it's not gone, it's just being hidden temporarily. So Alt, I'll click it, it's gone. So I'll go ahead and close that tab group. Actually, I'll bring that back and then come over here, drop it out, and then exit out of there. This tab here called Clone Source basically has a few options that I think are really important for people who are using a clone brush. I'll give you an example. As we talked about with our clone brush, when you sample and move over to another part of the image, making sure current and below is selected, you'll notice that it carries this white ball around. Or if I sample in the shirt and move it over, it carries a preview of whatever you're going to be pasting. Now that preview can be turned off by Show Overlay. And when you turn that off, it doesn't show you a preview anymore. You can simply just click, and then when you start painting or brushing, it'll then start adding the clone stamp without that preview previously. When I turn it back on, it brings back that preview before pasting. The reason why this preview exists is, for instance, if you start cloning lines, or if you clone something that has specific edges, you want to make sure they're perfectly overlaid before actually starting to clone. Show Overlay seems to be a really good option for you to enable before you start cloning objects. Or if you're working on really tight spaces, for instance. Another fun fact about the Clone Source tool is this Flip Horizontal button. If I enable that, what that does is if I start cloning, let's clone his face. I'll add a new layer and then start brushing. You can see the area that it starts cloning flips. It flips it horizontally, just like the tool says. Then you can hit Command T and transform and move it over, and she now has his face. And then simply enough with a mask, you could probably blend that in even better. But you get the idea what Clone Source is. It's used for many things like face swaps, or you could use it for changing over different garments or hair, anything that you want to make sure that the symmetry is perfect. Even works for beauty shots. Maybe you have something where one side of the lip might be smudged and you want to copy the clean side over to the other side. And the same thing goes here. It has a flip vertical option and the opacity as well. So this opacity is basically the opacity for the preview. If I change it down, it changes how transparent or opaque it is. So there it's like less transparent, so it's not as obvious. You can even change the blending mode, like we talked about, to show you where it's going to actually paste and to what degree. So you can see the preview goes away in the light parts. So I'll sample here. And it goes away in the hair because the hair is darker than the actual dress. So the dress will only paste in areas where it can actually darken whatever it is underneath it. Since it can't darken the hair, because the hair is darker already, it's not going to paste. So that's what that mode is for. So I'll turn Show Overlay off, and I will also turn, make sure all the other offsets are taken care of. And the rest of this I don't really touch either. So I'll close this, and we'll go to the next one. Now this histogram here is just a regular histogram. It shows you your levels. You can see there's a lot of blue going on in the deeper regions of the image, which I suspect is because of the shirt itself, because it's more in the shadows. So I'll close that one out, and I only use this if I ever need to see exactly what my histogram is like in case my screen is messed up or something like that. And I'm going to delete that face layer. The navigator here is a really useful feature. If you ever start zooming in too much to an image and you want to get a full scale of what's going on without actually going out again, the navigator itself is a really useful feature. It also allows you to jump from portions of an image to another in case you already zoomed in and you want to quickly go to the face. Then you can come back in here and go to the other side of the screen. You can make it quite large, maybe even adding it to the second screen and putting it there as a navigator, giving you a full perspective of what's going on. And as you can see, if I change the zooming distance on the navigator, it changes the actual zooming on your screen on the actual image. So let's close that. Second to last is swatches. Swatches are something that you can use to save different color palettes. For instance, if I go in and go to my eyedropper tool, the eyedropper tool picks up different colors. You can see the top bar here, and this is a new feature, Creative Cloud, where if I start just sampling different colors, it starts saving my last group of swatches, my last handful of them at least, temporarily. So you can go in and start clicking across the canvas and start saving them as a temporary save button. If you want to permanently save a color that you like, you can simply click on the new swatch and it names it. You can name it whatever you want, and it comes and saves it down here as your permanent feature. And then you can save swatches as well and save that group of swatches wherever you want, and it automatically defaults into these presets that is in your Adobe folder. Personally, if I save swatches, if I ever do or need to, I'll save them somewhere else so I can easily back it up. And how would we use these swatches? Well, that's relatively simple, because if we have an adjustment layer like solid color, we can then just come over to these swatches with their mouse, click on them, and it ends up sampling the exact tone that you want. And combine that with masks and other adjustment layers and blending modes, and you get the point. And the same thing goes for like gradient map or gradient. You can use swatches there as well. Now the last thing here is actions. I want to show you really quickly how to make a simple action, what they're actually used for. And we'll go over them in detail maybe in future tutorials. For example, if I have the actions open, and I will go ahead and clear or replace or reset. Let's reset them so we have the same screen as you do. Now these default actions themselves, honestly, they're not very useful, at least from my perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and select that folder and then come down to the delete button and then delete it. So let's set up a new folder and call this My Actions. Once My Actions is set, I can run and save a new action. So what an action is let's say that for a series of images, you want to increase the exposure using curves, and you know you're going to do that over a multiple set of images. Well, you can save your steps so that it records exactly what you're doing, and then you can replay it on another image. I'll give you an example. I'll hit New Action, and I'll say exposure. It's set to save under that folder. I can change the color if I want to. This function key is assigning a keyboard shortcut for it, for instance. But I'm not going to do that for now. I'll hit record. So it starts recording. And now I'm going to add a curve. And I'll increase the exposure. And say that I actually want this step repeated again and again. Say I do something else as well. Maybe I add levels and change some of my levels by bringing in my deepest points and making it deeper. Now you can see it's actually starting to record these steps. The first one says make adjustment layer. Then it goes on and indicates what it's doing. You don't have to know any of this because it's doing it for you. Once you're done, click on stop. And now anything you do furthermore, it's not being recorded. So even if I delete these two, I'll hold shift, click on both these layers, and delete. I can simply go back to my exposure. I can run this action by hitting play. And then you can see it automatically did my levels adjustment as well as my curve adjustment. All I would need to do then is open up another image and run that same action again, so we'll do the same steps. This will only work for things like adjustment layers or saving or anything else that isn't specific. So if you, for instance, use the clone brush and start cloning parts of the image and you run an action, it's not going to save the exact steps of cloning. But it's a great way to save different looks. Maybe you're doing color looks, maybe you're starting to add levels or curves across different images and you want to save it for consistency, you can do it that way. Those are pretty much all the other palettes in Photoshop that are most applicable to photography and retouching from my perspective. Now that we've talked about other palettes in Photoshop, let's go in and talk about the pen tool.